All right. Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be reacting to an interview between Stephen A. Smith and Ben Shapiro. Now, Ben Shapiro, I used to have a lot of respect for, but I now think he's a MAGA shill. And Stephen A. Smith is in a lot of interesting beef with LeBron James. He said some very controversial things, and also he kind of bid himself for president. I'm very curious to see how this conversation will go. I don't have a lot of expectation for Stephen A. Smith, although he's a good talker. I don't think he really knows anything about politics, but maybe he's going to prove me wrong. Let's dive right into it.
Subscribers. He is one of the preeminent conservative voices in the world, not just this country. And he's somebody that called me a jackass. He wanted to see his boy, your boy, as in me. Well, here I am, the Stephen A. Smith Show with Mr. Ben Shapiro. Up next. Holla.
Okay, Stephen A. Stand on timing.
Do usually 3 times a week at the very minimum over the digital airways of YouTube and of course iHeartRadio. Want to thank all my followers and subscribers for continuing the show on the show conversation around folks. He's beloved on to talk in the quirky rocker and sent a bevy of other on Hannity. As the trial went on, as evidence came forward, he believed otherwise. And once Derek Chauvin was convicted and sent to prison, in the aftermath of that, Donald Trump, the 45th president, in prison.
Hold on. Is Stephen A. spitting?
And in my estimation, he absolutely positively deserved it. When it came to talking about Derek Chauvin, the officer most of us believe, and the courts clearly believed, murdered George Floyd several years ago, sparking riots across the country at that particular moment in time. Derek Chauvin, an officer, a police officer from Minneapolis, Minnesota, ended up being convicted and sentenced to more than 21 years in prison. And in my estimation, he absolutely positively deserved it. Derek Chauvin is an individual that I believe murdered George Floyd, that most black Americans feel murdered George Floyd, along with a bevy of other people, not just blacks, not just whites, but even people in the conservative communities. The Sean Hannitys of the world and others proclaim the same thing. Ben Shapiro himself felt that way initially with what he had tweeted out. Upon further reflection, as the trial went on, as evidence came forward, he believed otherwise. And once Derek Chauvin was convicted and sent to prison, in the aftermath of that, Donald Trump, the 45th president of the United States, ultimately became the 47th president of the United States, winning this last election in November of 2024. And from that moment on, once he re-entered the White House on January 20th, 2025, Ben Shapiro has stated for the record that he believes Donald Trump should pardon Derek Chauvin.
I took so this is the angle we're going. Okay.
I didn't know what he was thinking. I said to myself, why would you suggest such a thing? And I even went so far as to say or to ask Ben Shapiro, a devout Jew who is incredibly supportive of Israel and the Jewish community and issues pertaining to the Jewish community, I asked a simple question. If George Floyd had been Jewish and there was a knee on his neck for over 9 minutes, would he feel the same way? So Ben Shapiro, with his own platform, which is very formidable, I might add, came right back, accused me essentially of race baiting, says it's something that I do all the time, says he's got to turn down the volume every time I'm speaking. He said a lot of things about me. And to his credit, when I invited him on the show to have a man-to-man conversation, he did not hesitate. He actually was supposed to do this days ago. I had to postpone. So giving credit where credit is due, giving him an opportunity to express whatever it is that he wanted to express to me about.
I low-key think, though, and I'm not giving Ben Shapiro the benefit of the doubt because I do think he's spineless, is that he thinks that he would railroad you in a conversation and while also getting more exposure. So I think he was more willing to do a conversation like that. I mean, if you think it's an easy W and you get more clout, can I blame him? I guess.
me about George Floyd, about the whole situation involving his murder at the hands of Derek Chauvin and beyond, I was more than happy to do so. Gave me 30 minutes of his time. And I think it's safe to say that both of us might have learned a little thing or two from this conversation we had. How pleasant was it?
Stephen A. Smith got destroyed.
How tense was it? You'll have to watch to see for yourself. I'm not going to give away the details. All I'm going to tell you is that it's worth watching. You might, keep the way.
All right, let's get into it.
Gas. Just do. Smith Show wants to make sure you a tip is real. And first, Ben Shapiro Show. He recently made headlines. Get into that.
How are you doing?
Okay, I want to ask, and I asked this affectionately. I'm not trying to be incendiary. You called me a jackass. How many dudes do you call a jackass and then you go on this show? Could you tell me that? Could you answer that one first?
Hey, I appreciate you having me on, and the invitation, as you know, is open the other way around. It's shockingly, the answer's probably a lot, actually, in terms of the number of people who I've called a jackass who I've then actually become friendly with, or who I've had on the show, or vice versa. So, you're in this business, you know it.
I got you. I'm not overly offended. Trust me on that. All right. But thank you for coming on the show. So let's get right into it. As you know, I spoke out against your petition to get President Trump to pardon former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. For those that don't know, Chauvin was sentenced to 22 years in prison after being convicted of unintentional second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter of George Floyd. I wondered if you would feel that way if the officer was black and the victim was Jewish. That was what I said. And your response was to call me a race baiter. Why is that, Ben Shapiro?
Well, to me, the entire case against Derek Chauvin was rooted in a sort of public racial essentialism that I thought was unnecessary to analyze the case. If I'm going to look at this case and just look at the facts of the case, the race of the person on the ground and the race of the officer are irrelevant, and we should treat it exactly the same, whether both people were black, both people are white, one person was Jewish, one person was not Jewish. The identity of the person on the ground, I think, should not be the deciding factor in whether or not Derek Chauvin was convicted of second-degree murder. It should be the situation, the facts of the case, the autopsy report, and all of the rest. And so the thing that I actually objected to was the suggestion that my opinion would have changed, rooted in the, say, racial or religious identity of the person who died, as opposed to the racial or religious identity of the person who was the police officer. I just don't think that that's how we ought to decide criminal justice cases in general.
In fairness to you, I can understand that in general. Damn it, in most instances, I can agree with that. But those are cases that we hear about. I'm talking about the visual impact. So let's stay right there, Ben. I am a black man, and I see this black man on the ground, face down, handcuffs behind him. Face is imprinted into the pavement. The knee of the police officer is on the back of his neck. He's literally saying he can't breathe, to one point crying for his mama. And it happens for over 9 minutes. I understand from a technical perspective, from a specific analytical perspective, forensic evidence, et cetera, fentanyl in the system, et cetera. I got all of that. My point is, and my question to you at that time was, seeing that, how could you have another opinion? How could it be based on the preponderance of evidence that you threw into the fray in order to ask for this man to be pardoned? I'm just going by, like, there are certain things that you just see, and 1 + 1 = 2.
So, I mean, Stephen, actually, if you go back to my tweets at the time, May 30th and June 1st, if you look at my tweets, I'm saying the same kind of things you're saying right now. I'm saying the same kind of things at that time that everybody else is saying, seeing the tape, because there's no way to look at the tape
I saw that.
and not be sort of shocked by what you're seeing on the tape, obviously. And then I think that the mark of a reasonable person is to change your opinion as the evidence changes. A lot of evidence emerged between the time that the tape was released, that horrible 9-minute tape, and the time the conviction actually happened. I mean, there's a full trial, there were autopsy reports, there was witness evidence, there were other people whose testimony was taken, there were multiple medical specialists who were called. And so in looking at
the fear, though, is that you're not doing things based off what evidence is being presented. You do things based off what the general reception of the evidence indicate, especially being on the side of the right wing, which is at this point extreme MAGA. And extreme MAGA hates, I'm gonna be honest, they hate a lot of things race-based. So I don't know. I question your integrity, so it's hard to say.
And all of that, that's the way we're supposed to adjudicate whether or not a person deserves to spend 22 years in prison, not based simply on our immediate gut response to the tape. And again, I had the same gut response to the tape that you did, and I think that everybody did. I think actually that tends to be the gut response of people when we see a lot of police activity. Actually, it turns out that the police do a lot of things that look really rough on tape and really difficult on tape, and this was one of those things. And then as we later learned that, for example, the sort of tactic that Chauvin is using there was actually trained by the Minneapolis Police Department, right? Putting a submission technique that's used if you have a person who's resisting arrest, or if you learn during the course of the investigation that George Floyd was saying, "I can't breathe," before he was even taken out of the car. He says, "I can't breathe" on the longer tape 6 times before he's even taken out of the car. I mean, it's a very long interaction with the police officers before you get to that 9-minute tape, the part that we all saw. And there's a part of the story that you can't see on the tape, which is the reverse angle. You can't see that there's a big crowd that shouting at Chauvin. Chauvin is responding to that crowd. One of the preliminaries to getting up off of Floyd that way is to call what's called a code 4, which is where it's an all clear, where you feel that the crowd is not a threat to you. In fact, even the EMTs who showed up to provide care for Floyd didn't call a code 4 when they arrived on scene because they thought that the crowd was too threatening. So once you take into account all of the facts, if your opinion doesn't change and the fact pattern is different from what you originally thought it was, then you're not doing your job as a commentator. So I can have the same gut response that you have when I first see that tape. The question is what you do when more of those facts emerge, when you do see more of that evidence emerge, when you do read the testimony and see the autopsies.
See, but I believe, and this is just my belief, because in fairness to you, you're absolutely right. You did put out that tweet initially, and your position was it was shared by the Hannitys of the world, the Mark Levins of the world, and various others, obviously with a lot of people on the left as well, before the preponderance of evidence that you're alluding to came into play. I get that. So in fairness to you, I have to say that. But sometimes I'm going to say this to you because you're a pretty brilliant dude. Nobody can deny it with what you've accomplished with the Daily Wire, what you've been able to do in your career. I'm just reading something. You were a syndicated columnist at the age of 17 for crying out loud. This is who you are. This is who I'm talking to here. Is it possible that sometimes we could be so brilliant that our intellect gets in the way of common sense? For example, what I mean by that is this, Ben. It was a knee on his neck for 9.5 minutes. If that didn't happen, is he still alive? I'm not talking about today because anything could have happened to you. I'm just saying the fact that Derek Chauvin's knee was on his neck, that to me should speak for itself, because if the man is clamoring for you to get off the back of his neck while you got him handcuffed into the ground, okay, why is it wrong for us to stop there and say that was excessive on the part of the police officer because you had him contained? He wasn't a threat to you. What's wrong with that thinking?
Okay, so there are a couple of things that could be argued by the defense, and in fact were argued by the defense in this case. One of them, again, was that this was a trained technique by the Minneapolis Police Department to keep somebody in this position so long as you have not called a code 4, which is where you say there's an all clear, and now you can move the person who's on the ground into the ambulance, for example, if you've already called the ambulance, or back into the police vehicle. When it comes to the actual question as to causation of death, right, you have to be the proximate cause of the death. It's not just enough for it to be a contributing factor, because it turns out that increased stress can cause death in a person who has a human heart that is significantly larger than normal. The autopsy showed that Floyd, unfortunately, had an incredibly enlarged heart, much heavier than normal. His lungs were much larger than normal person's lungs because of heavy and overtime drug use. He had 11 nanograms of fentanyl in his system at the time per milliliter of blood, which is over 3 times what it would cause normally to kill somebody. The original autopsy report openly said that if George Floyd had been found in his house in the same exact physical condition, they would have called it death by overdose. So, all of these things taken into account raises the question of reasonable doubt, right? The standard in our criminal justice system is in fact a reasonable doubt standard. And that raises the question as to why there's not, at the very least, reasonable doubt. So you can say that your sort of first jump at this is he's guilty. Look at the knee on his neck. There's no damage to his neck tissue, by the way, in the autopsy report. You can say all of that, and you can say that that's a plausible explanation. I won't even make the case that that's not a plausible explanation. I'll make the case that a plausible explanation is not enough to convict a man in court, especially based on the surrounding circumstances, the amount of pressure that was brought. This was not a fair trial, is one of the points that I'm making. So when it comes to the actual trial itself, there are members of the jury who are at actual rallies wearing shirts that said "I can't breathe" before they were actually on the jury. There are members of the jury who have openly said that they felt public pressure to convict in a particular way. The president of the United States, or one of the people who was running for president of the United States at the time, Joe Biden, was openly calling for his conviction. The Minneapolis city paid the family of George Floyd, I believe it was a $27 million payout in the middle of the trial. So all of this tends to go to, is that an impartial jury, right? These all have serious consequences for the jury system. And so there's really a few separate questions. One is, was Chauvin responsible for Floyd's death? I think on that question, I would say no. You can say yes. I would say at the very least there's reasonable doubt. And then there's the question of the amount of pressure that was brought on the jury in this particular case to bring a verdict. This was the most highly publicized trial of the modern era by a long shot, because the incident itself had spurred so much public angst and outrage and massive protests involving 20 million people and riots that had cost the taxpayers some $2 billion, or insurance companies some $2 billion. It was the most highly publicized trial probably since the OJ trial. And because of that amount of public pressure, did Chauvin receive a fair trial is obviously a very crucial question here.
But it sounds like your position is that this is more of a political issue as opposed to a policing issue. And what I would say to you as a black man in America, that there are times, and there's a preponderance of evidence throughout the years that shows that policing has been an issue as it pertains to black men, which is one of the things that we constantly bring up. So when that incident happened, I'm thinking about the officer himself, Ben Shapiro, and his intent from the standpoint, you're having your knee on the back of his neck, no matter what, from a medical perspective, we can deduce may have transpired. In the end, if you didn't have your knee on the back of his neck for that amount of time or exceeding 9 minutes, this would not have been the outcome. And because you were insensitive to that, as a trained police officer who should know better, there should be a level of culpability that comes in your direction. So when somebody looks at you, I look at, and this is where I want it to go as well, I'm looking at a Ben Shapiro. And this is what I meant when I asked the question about you being, about if George Floyd was a Jewish person. I owe you an explanation for that. So I want to give it to you right now. You are known as a proud Jewish individual, incredibly supportive of the Jewish community, being amongst them, Israel, other things. And I was bringing this up because I said, if that were a Jewish person, the conclusion that you ultimately reached, would you have been patient enough to draw that conclusion, peeling from the information that was deduced on an objective level to reach the conclusion that, hey, you know what? I don't think he should have been put in jail. That's where I was going, because I know how defensive, or I shouldn't say defensive, but a defender of the Jewish community that you are. And that's what I was thinking along those lines.
I mean, but I certainly hope so, because I can name you a dozen Jewish criminals who absolutely deserve to be in jail, right? And Jeffrey Epstein.
No, not buying that. And not buying that, especially since it's when it's a political issue. When it's like very apparent, sure. That's an easy thing to say. It's an easy way to get yourself to seem like you're objective. But you've been a stark defender of Israel, and I'm very curious what you think about Israel's current actions. Are you critical of them? Are you critical of Netanyahu? See, when it's a more of a politicized issue where it's very clear that your side is defending them unconditionally, then I don't know if you would jump boat, because I think you don't have integrity. I think you're a shill, Shapiro.
Was a Jew.
No, I'm just talking about that kind of incident.
Hell, right? I mean, I think that.
I'm just talking about that kind of incident.
And my point is that whenever, I'm also a lawyer, right? I mean, my identity as a Jew does not mean I have solidarity with a criminal who happens to be a Jew, or a person who's in a controversial law enforcement confrontation who happens to be a Jew. I mean, my job is to literally remove myself from, and I think also that, as those original tweets show, I don't think that you have to have racial solidarity with the person in order to feel empathy for that person's situation. I think that the whole basis of a democratic republic, or us having a conversation right now, is the fact that we can speak to each other across racial and identitarian lines. And so, again, I think that there are an enormous number of people in the country who disagree with me, by the way, who share both my race, and a lot of Jews who, I would say the vast majority of Jews disagree with me on this, or many white Americans who looked at George Floyd and had exactly the same reaction.
Nope, nah, not equatable, because you got to speak on the side that you actually belong to. It's not really the Jewish, it's the Jewish right wing. And more specifically, it's MAGA.
And as you say, initially, I had the same reaction as you, and that had nothing to do with race. And so the kind of idea that let's put it this way, if race is a barrier to logic, then race is the problem, not the solution. Right? Let me ask you this. I mean, if you looked at, you said before that you didn't look at the autopsy report, you're not taking a lot of time looking at the evidence or the autopsy. What would it take for you to change your mind on the case? Or is there nothing that could change your mind on the case because you saw the tape, for example?
Well, it wouldn't take much, and this is why I said this, because normally I would look at the autopsy reports, whatever. You know, I saw people bringing up his arrest record. I saw people bringing up fentanyl in the system. I saw all of these things, and all I could come to, Ben, fair or unfair, was that none of that matters if he wasn't on the ground with a knee on the back of his neck for 9+ minutes. Because I'm looking at a trained police officer who should know better. I looked at the experts who were saying, they're trained, there was no reason, and you saw it, I'm sure you saw this, and not to say that you would embrace it with the level of sincerity that others may, because I know the level of skepticism that you look at when you see the news outlets. And by the way, I don't blame you. I'm with you on that, okay? But I would say to you, listening to experts talk about how police officers are trained and pointing to the fact that Derek Chauvin had no business being in that position and putting George Floyd in that position, particularly once he was handcuffed and contained. To me, that, along with the ultimate outcome, is all the evidence I need. And that's where we might differ.
Right. I mean, that's totally fair if we differ on that. I guess the question I would ask you is, given the fact that that was a Minneapolis Police Department trained protocol, given the fact that Floyd did ask to be removed from the car, I mean, in the lead up to the situation, the part of the tape that nobody watches, he was actually outside the car. The police officers move him inside the car. He says he's claustrophobic, and then he claims 6 consecutive times that he cannot breathe while he's in the car. So if the idea is that it was the police officer's knee that deprives him of breath, he was already claiming that he couldn't breathe inside.
So I wonder if Stephen A is going to ask this. A reasonable question. Now, I'm gonna be honest, I don't have a strong opinion regarding the George Floyd stuff, but if he said he couldn't breathe, and then you put him in a situation where it's even harder to breathe, does that make sense? Stephen A, I just want you to ask that question.
Inside the car, suggesting he was already in the middle of some sort of medical event, right? And then he was brought outside the car. I guess the question that I have for you, again, is what level of evidence would need to be shown to create a reasonable doubt? I mean, you seem incredibly certain. Right? All I'm saying is that the reasonable doubt standard is what pertains in criminal justice. What would it take to get you to reasonable doubt? Or is there no reasonable doubt that could be achieved simply by dint of the fact that he had his knee on his neck? By the way, it's not for the full 9 minutes. There are minutes where it's on his back. I mean, even the prosecution acknowledges that. The real question is, I think, the last 50 seconds, right? The last 50 seconds of the tape where Floyd stops breathing and Chauvin's knee is still on his neck. That is really the question as to whether this goes into criminal charge territory. Otherwise, he ends up being in a position where he's actually just using a typical subdual technique before you put the guy back in the car and you take him off to jail.
We all understand that typical techniques can be used in terrible scenarios and situations where it can become a worst thing if you use the technique in this specific situation. Like, just because it's a technique that can be used doesn't mean it's a technique that should be used, depending on the situation, of course. So he keeps on saying that, but I mean, I think that's just an easy way to kind
Now
of
I'm saying to answer your question, there's
obfuscate
absolutely
blame.
nothing that could convince me that Derek Chauvin deserved a different outcome because of what you just articulated, what we saw, even if it's for the last 50 seconds. I'm not changing my position. I understand
Chauvin
where
was
you're
a
coming from.
racist. I mean, this is a
I'm
real
sorry.
question. Do you think so? We've talked about race a little bit. Do you think that
Oh,
Chauvin
sure. But
was a racist? This is a race-based crime, in your view?
do I believe that?
Yes.
I don't believe that based on anything about his history that they articulated because I know how people conjure up evidence to go at it. I do believe his actions indicated that because I didn't see him doing that with anybody else. And the times that we were living in and the climate, as you articulated accurately, I might add, the heightened level of sensitivity that it exists because of brutality on the part of some police officers. By the way, I never say police brutality because I don't like to castigate all police officers that way. I know if I'm in trouble, I'm calling 911. I'm not going to sit up there and denigrate police officers
I
throughout this country.
respect that,
But there's
Stephen.
rogues that exist in every profession. And I think there's rogues that exist with certain police officers. So to me, he came across as one. And that was my problem with it. Having said that, I want to get to something else because we're going to stay on this subject of race in this regard. When you saw the climate that exists, I understand you believe it was primarily instigated by the left. I want to know where you draw the line in the sand and in terms of veering away from the political and just looking at a case on its merit and saying, this is what I see. This is where I stand, completely devoid of politics. I'm not talking race. I'm talking politics, meaning this has nothing to do with politics. This is the climate that we're living in. This officer should have known better, etc. Do you ever find yourself in a position where you're able to dismiss yourself from the political impact of something or the political agenda of something to draw your conclusions?
Well, I mean, honestly, I think that in this particular case, this is a good indicator of trying to withdraw from a political sort of calculation, given the fact that, as some people have pointed out, on a pragmatic level, they've suggested that President Trump pardoning Derek Chauvin would be bad for President Trump politically. And the case that I've made is that's his job, to determine what's pragmatic for him politically. It's my job to call something out as wrong when I see it to be wrong. In terms of criminal justice cases that have involved race, where I've removed myself on the other side, I mean, there are a bunch of them. Walter Scott, right, is a great example of a black man who was victimized by a white police officer. The police officer ends up convicted and going to jail. You're saying I'm not campaigning on his behalf because he deserves to go to jail, the officer in the Walter Scott case. There have been a number of horrifying or police-involved crimes in which the police officer deserves to lose his job and or go to jail.
I feel like some things are just like very clear and objective, and it's something that can't be argued. And you don't have to worry about the pressure of MAGA coming down on you or the pressure of the right wing coming down on you. I am more curious. And if I was Stephen A. Smith and I know this conversation was going to happen, I would have researched a very particular situation to see his stance, to see if there's that level of consistency. I would have wondered whether or not Ben Shapiro acted in opposition of what his side, MAGA and the right wing, said in a contentious race-based police situation, right? There's a lot of situations that I conjure up a conclusion based off information that is given to me. I absolutely do not care what the left and right says about a situation. I come up with my own conclusion based off what I see and what I research, right? So I'm just curious to see if Ben Shapiro does the same because I personally don't think he does the same. I think he's a shill. So if Stephen A. had an example, I would be very curious if he would have if he asked one.
Depending on the activities of the police officer. And you have to analyze those one by one. And I think that what we've seen, particularly from the legacy media over the course of the last many years, is that the only types of stories that tend to break into the news are ones with a black victim and a white police officer. And the media immediately jump to a particular narrative conclusion on the basis of that. And even if the facts end up debunking that conclusion, that narrative continues to be maintained. I mean, a good example of this might be Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, where the initial claim was that Michael Brown was shot in the back by a police officer in cold blood. And it turned out that every aspect of that story was false. And yet there are still people who will, sort of repeat the hands up, don't shoot lie that never happened. I mean, that literally never.
Here's an example I'll give you. I wonder what his thoughts are regarding Alex Jones and the Sandy Hook case. I think that's a very interesting one to see if he has any type of integrity. I think that's something I would ask. What's another kind of race-based one? No, not the Kyle Rittenhouse, because I actually agree that Kyle Rittenhouse was not going after racist. That was kind of, so I agree with Ben Shapiro there. Sometimes the legacy media can be proliferating wrongful information, but also a lot of times social media also proliferates wrong information. So I hate when they just blame legacy media. I think it's lazy, to be honest. I think it's inappropriate and unprofessional. But I'm curious to see if he would stay consistent.
never happened. And that was debunked by the Eric Holder Department of Justice, for example.
Okay.
So I think that we really do have to look at each one of these situations in isolation. We're talking about the life of a person. If you're talking about narrative, if you're talking about sort of generalized race in America, then I think that it's important to look at as much data as humanly possible. I'm a data-driven person, and so I'll look at everything from the studies of Roland Fryer over at Harvard University about
I don't
police
think you're a data-driven
misconduct
person.
toward minorities, and it
Not
ranges on the scale,
anymore,
by the way.
anyway.
What Roland
That's why I
Fryer
lost
studies tend to
respect
show
to you.
is that, for example, there's no disproportionate killing of black men by the police. There's disproportionate use of lower level uses of forces by police depending on the circumstance based on race. So that's something Roland Fryer has found at Harvard. Right? Like that's the sort of conversation that I think is useful and interesting. But I think that when it gets
But you don't have that conversation. I think you actually focus on the killing part, because I agree and I know the exact statistic you're talking about. But that second part you don't talk about at all. Ben Shapiro, you've never talked about the overuse of force for low-level crimes towards black people. And you emphasized, you had inflection when you mentioned that there is not a disproportionate amount of killings, which I agree with, statistically correct. But you're not interested about the conversation about the black people getting abused. You're not interested at all. When have you ever talked about it? So stop lying. Stop lying and pretending like you're this nuanced individual. You're not. You aren't.
telescoped into one particular case, and then that case is used as sort of the meta-narrative justifier. That's really negative, and that's really bad for the country. Because what we should be doing, you want to lose trust in the criminal justice system overall, telegraph all race relations into the OJ case, the Michael Brown case, the Derek Chauvin case, the George Floyd case. If you take all of America's race relations and you sort of put it on the back of one particular fact pattern, usually the fact pattern is not capable of carrying that narrative burden.
But Ben, isn't that easy for us on?
But you're also missing all the other instances throughout American history where black people were destroyed in the criminal justice system, were taken advantage of in the criminal justice system. Like, if we're talking about the outweighing of, I'm not going to say corruption necessarily, but unfair bias treatment based off race, it's heavily skews unfair and bias against black people.
On the outside, looking at data, looking at analytics to draw those conclusions, as opposed to us having a personal experience or a personal investment in it. Like, for example, when it comes to the Jewish community, I would never think for 1 second that I could fully grasp and inhale what you experience as a Jewish person in the United States of America, when we've seen heightened levels of anti-Semitism, for example, and people alluding to those kind of things. Well, I'm not a Jewish person, so I wouldn't know. What about the argument that when we talk about black folks, you can point to data all you want to, and we get that part, but the real experiences that we endure from time to time is not something that you can necessarily calculate. How serious do you take those assertions coming from a community, whether it's your own mind or anybody else's?
Obviously, it's true that we can never fully get into one another's shoes, right? I mean, that's just the reality of the world, and that's true beyond race. That's just true for individuals. You, Stephen, or me as an individual, you can't live in my shoes. I can't live in your. We're different people. We live different lives. But when it comes to making public policy, then the only sort of gauge that you can have really is the data. Because anecdotal evidence, you can't make public policy for millions of people based on anecdotal evidence, because you can't legislate people's feelings. I mean, this is sort of one of my things. When it comes to trying to craft law, for example.
He's mostly right. But what pisses me off is he says that we can't make policy out of anecdotal experiences. We have to make policy out of data. But MAGA, right now, that you endorse, are making executive orders and policies off of feelings, not data. Because the data says the Department of Education does not have all this responsibility that Trump lies about. The data says that illegal immigrants are not the criminals that people are trying to make it out to seem. The data says that trans situations and transing kids is a very, very non-existent problem. It doesn't happen. It's illegal. There's so much data that debunks MAGA, but you keep quiet because you have no integrity. So all this sounds good, but you're not truly objective. You're not truly honest. You're not truly adherent to data to form policy. You're a liar. You are a hypocrite. Ben Shapiro, all this intelligence is going out the wayside because you're just a talking head now. That's all you are. You're no different from the legacy media you criticize. So I'm glad we are on the same page on a certain sentiment, but one person follows it, the other person doesn't.
making law based on the personal feelings of people's quote unquote lived experiences is a bad way to make law that is going to have to be generally applicable. Because I may have particular feelings about a particular criminal case based on my own personal experiences. But if we do that, then what you end up with is a really high level of tribalism in which it's if your racial identity prevails or my racial identity prevails, really bad things can come from that. And
Oh, he's spitting. Tribalism. You mean MAGA? You mean MAGA's tribalism? I'm glad. It's like he says things that are true, but then he doesn't apply them.
the law is designed to treat people as equal individuals underneath it. And so, the relevance of lived experience, that may play a part in us being able to understand one another as individuals if we're having conversation over dinner, or if we're giving advice to each other about our kids. But when it comes to actually making public policy, it's a different thing.
Yeah, you got to, and you make a valid point about policy. When you talk about policy, you can't just go by personal experience. It's got to be the numbers, it's got to be the data. I totally get that. By the way, just as an aside before I get to my next question, lung expert testified George Floyd died because his breathing was restricted. So I just wanted to point that out now, because again, that's with the weight on his neck, we got to remember that. But let me go to this. I mean, the Trump pardon, which you obviously was advocating for, would only affect Chauvin's federal conviction where he pleaded guilty for violating.
Stephen A., you should have stayed on to that. You didn't want to address that a little bit more? I feel like you could have really nailed into the idea that there are definitely forces that played into his breathing getting worse.
Floyd civil rights. The pardon would have no bearing on his state sentence for second degree and third degree murder. Even if Minnesota Governor Tim Walz pardoned him, he'd remain in prison regardless of Trump's actions. Of all the things to ask President Trump to pardon, Ben, why this, Ben? Why
so, so I've asked President Trump to do many, many things. This is certainly not the only thing that I'd like President Trump to do, ranging from tariff policy to foreign policy to tax policy. There are many things that I ask President Trump to do on a daily basis on the show. On this one, because I think that it was such a driver of a narrative that I actually do think is false and has been damaging in the United States, which is the idea that there is a tremendous amount of racial tension in America and that's accelerated over the past couple of decades. I think that it's important to elevate individual justice above, again, that sort of group identity-based narrative for the sake of the body politic. The BLM movement of 2020 was at the very least incredibly divisive and on a material level incredibly damaging to the United States. And I think that one of the things that I'd like to get back to in the United States is a time when we actually had pretty good racial feelings about one another, and it wasn't all that long ago. I think that if you go back to the polling data, yes, if you go back
between the black community and the Jewish community, sure, but the black community and white community?
So if you go back to Gallup polls of 2012, literally 2012, in 2012, 75% of white Americans thought that race relations were on a good path with black Americans, and 65% of black Americans also thought that race relations were on a good path in the United States. And then by 2014, it had all dumped down into the below 50 mark for both whites and black Americans, and it never recovered from there. And one of the inciting events of that was, in fact, the riots in Ferguson and the sort of elevation of this narrative that America was deeply systemically racist in incurable ways, and that every inequality in American life could be chalked up to.
Because I'm objective, I will note that I do dislike a lot of the things that people have brought up in calling everything racist and calling everything, institutional and racist. The whole conversation about, oh yeah, you can't be a racist when you're black, like all that stuff was fucking stupid. So I agree there.
Inequities that were buried in the founding of the country and this whole broader racial narrative, which I think, again, that the best way to get past a lot of these problems, honestly, is it sounds naive, but it isn't. It's just reality. Any group problems, the best way to get past a group problem, if you're an individual, is to talk with another individual and to treat another individual as an individual, as opposed to trying to reduce everything to group identity, which is the reason I think I objected so strongly when you started talking about racial identity with regard to this case, because my whole point was, when it comes to interpersonal situations, the best way to treat other human beings, of course, is not as a member of a race. The best way to treat them is as individuals. And of course, a race is a component of their identity, but you treat them as an individual.
Do you treat immigrants as individuals? Do you treat trans people as individuals? Do you treat Palestinians as individuals? I wonder if you again, you keep these consistent sentiments consistent,
regardless of what their race is.
Yeah, but my pushback with you would be, Ben, I came at what you said, not at you. You see what I'm saying? Because there's a lot of things that you say and do that I don't disagree with. I'm a centrist. And there's some things, well, damn it, when you make sense, you make sense, okay? We're having this discussion right here. I'm listening to some of your points. I'm like, hey, making sense or something. I mean, I get it. I might disagree, but I can't refute where you're coming from. It makes a lot of sense. And what I would ask you before we go, because I know you got to get on out of here, and I can't thank you enough for your time. And again, I'm going to come on your show when you ask me to as well. I really, really appreciate it. I'm not going to run from it. But I got to ask you this. When you talk about just treating individuals as individuals, one could easily argue that Ben Shapiro, with over 7.2 million followers, by the way, on his YouTube show. Okay, let's get that out the way with the Daily Wire and what you've been doing with that for years.
Holy glaze.
Folks are not necessarily treated as individuals. There is groupthink. There are, and I'm not talking about just you. I'm talking about all of us. I'm talking about all of us. I'm guilty of this. You're guilty of everybody in my estimation.
God, bro.
Where we think about something, when you had an issue with how I came at you, you brought up the left. And I'm disagreeing with the left at least 50% of the time, but you associated me with the left. When you've disagreed with others, I've heard you associate them with a group as opposed to treating them as individuals. So that seems to be counter to what you just articulated.
So I think that you're right to point out that I should characterize you as an individual with individual political views. Sure, I could do a better job of that. And when it comes to ideological grouping, I will say there is a difference between ideological grouping and, say, racial grouping. Right? Race is an immutable characteristic of who people are. No matter how many Kenny G tunes you listen to, Stephen, you'll still be a black man, and no matter and no matter what racial stereotype I engage in, I'll still be a nerdy Jewish guy. That's just the way it is. But when it comes to ideological groups are quite real, obviously, and so describing people as a member of an ideological camp, I don't think is targeting a group in the same way as it would be to target blacks as a group, or Jews as a group, or Asians as a group, or any other immutable characteristic.
Hey, Ben, we're running out of time. I know you've got to go. I've got to go. I would love to further this conversation with you into the future. Your show, my show, and it doesn't matter. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm thankful that you came on. My last question, am I still a jackass? I just want to make sure. Am I still a jackass? I just want to know.
No. Now you're the best, Stephen. That's how this works.
Oh my gosh, Stephen A is a shill. I'm sorry, Stephen A. This interview sucked. All right. Was it? No. Okay, let me be fair. All right. Was it a good political interview? No. You absolutely got railroaded. Was it a good conversation between two men? Sure. But I mean, I don't like Ben Shapiro right now, so I mean, I'm gonna be a little different here. Conservative here, and I must say I don't agree with Stephen A on many things. His willingness to talk anyway. Shut up. I feel like I went back 30 years watching people have that. Oh, give me a break. All these conservatives. Oh, look at these healthy conversations. Now all the conservatives are filling his comment section because he interviewed Ben Shapiro. Oh, this was not an awesome conversation. Now, especially since he said he was a centrist and that he agreed with Ben Shapiro, Stephen A, you're not going to be a Democratic candidate, bro. You're moving into you're going to start shifting to the right. This is kind of how things happen. So this is what the trend typically is, right? Because a lot of these people end up having these situations where they don't know anything. They have generalized opinions. Then they start getting bullied by the left because the left is emotional. So he's going to start getting bullied by the left. And then his centrism is going to start shifting to the right because he saw how nice Ben Shapiro is. That is literally how it goes every single time. I keep on saying left, stop being so emotional. And this just keeps on happening. So it is what it is. With that said, let me know your thoughts about the interview. Hope you guys enjoyed. You have a good one. Take care and peace.